I'm Colleen Hill, curator of costume and accessories.
I'm Valerie Steele, Director and Chief Curator of the Museum at FIT. Welcome to Shoes, Anatomy, Identity, Magic, open at the Museum at FIT through December 31st, 2022. Well, this is the third shoe exhibition that I've done at FIT, and the second one I worked on with you.
Yes.
So what do we have left to say about shoes?
Well, that was the challenge. And what was really fun was that this exhibition is based entirely on our permanent collection. So we really got to shape the themes based on what we have.
Yes. I mean, the whole point of doing it was that we had the request from Taschen to do a big book about our own fabulous shoe collection of 5,000 plus pairs of shoes. But it was interesting because we'd touched on identity in shoes before, but it was your brilliant idea to bring in anatomy. And I think that really, that was crucial. And then because you'd done the fairy tale fashion, magic also came in as a kind of surprising but fabulous inclusion for the show.
Absolutely. I'm really fascinated by the theme of anatomy, which really explores how we walk in shoes, how we stand in shoes. And it was surprising to me, working with a professor here at FIT, what makes a shoe more wearable or more ergonomically correct. And often those things aren't entirely predictable just by looking at the style of the shoe.
But you have to know it, because I remember you pointed out that one high-heeled shoe, which is a very high heel, and you said, look how, because it's curved in this way, and then the front of it, talk about how the front of the shoe helps you walk.
Sure. Well, particularly when you are wearing a platform shoe, which can of course be very high, there's a little upturn at the toe that's called the toe spring. And it can't be too much of a turn because then you'll just tip forward. But if it's a little bit of one, it allows you to walk with a little bit more of a natural gait. So rather than shuffling or stomping, you can move along smoothly.
Is that why I fall down so much with sneakers? Because they have a different kind of toe spring than other shoes?
It's interesting because I can't wear sneakers either. I find them very uncomfortable, so maybe it's just because we're used to wearing certain kinds of shoes. That may very well be it.
Well, I've sort of switched to sneakers after the pandemic. I got addicted to sneakers and sports sandals, but it is definitely a different kind of walking.
And you're used to it now.
And every time I've fallen down and broken something, people have said, and were you wearing high heels? And I never was, but it was so interesting that everybody was immediately blaming the victim.
Completely. High heels are always the culprit for many things, I think.
And then with magic, I was astonished doing research for the Taschen book that so many people really believe that shoes have magical powers. And you'd already kind of discovered that.
Absolutely. I explored particularly the idea of the glass slipper and how even during the 20th century it was first white shoes were considered these beautiful little Cinderella slippers. And then we get into things like clear vinyl and lucite shoes, and those are the Cinderella slippers. And then you had a really amazing artwork that you put on view in the exhibition that's related to that theme as well.
Yeah, Camille Normand did a pair of glass slippers that she made, and I bought many years ago, and made out of shards of broken glass, and quite large actually, so it'll be like almost a size 10 or something. And I remember I saw them in an exhibition of shoe art, and I just really wanted to buy them. And she said she'd been working on a project about how clothes were oppressive to women in many ways, and so that was her inspiration. And when women saw it, like I saw it, and I said, oh my God, did you cut yourself? And she said men saw it, and they'd all go, oh, Cinderella. It's terrifying with broken shards of glass.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Women often do think much more about how shoes will affect their feet, how they'll feel, their anatomy, than men often do. But that reminds me that within anatomy, we have a really fascinating pair of shoes by Pierre Cardin that are shaped like feet, and it's so rare to find that.
Well, that's a really surreal pair of shoes. I mean, directly taken, I guess, from Magritte's image, the idea that shoes which normally just kind of crush your feet and squish the toes in, and to have something that has separate toes, and it's just designed to look exactly like the outer shell of your foot.
Right, and apparently ergonomically correct, according to our professor friend.
That's cool. Shoes seem to be perennially popular. I remember when we did Shoe Obsession, one of the guards came up to me and said, "Miss Val, people sure do love shoes."
It's true. And I think one of the things that attracts people to shoes so much is that, firstly, they can completely make an outfit. Many people really center their personal style on a pair of shoes or a style of shoes, but also they're quite accessible. So one of the themes within the exhibition is how people relate to designer shoes in particular, and how that allows access to a particular brand or a particular identity. And I think that's really important. Many of us can fit into shoes quite easily, whereas fitting into clothing can be a bit more difficult.
Well, when I did my first book and interviewed a lot of women about shoes, that's what came up a lot. The idea that if bathing suit shopping was the most painful, shoe shopping was the most delightful, because everybody can wear a beautiful pair of shoes, even if you can't walk in it. I discovered that a lot of people I talked to said, well, they didn't really care if they could walk in it as long as it looked beautiful. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have a shoe shop in the middle of the exhibition, to bring to light kind of the allure of shoes, and also the kind of fetishism that surrounds shoes. It's not only sexual fetishism, but also has something to do with consumerism.
And on the theme of fetishism, can you talk to us a little bit about the high heels section, and particularly the shift in high heels from men's fashion into women's fashion?
Well, we tend to think of high heels as being women's shoes, and of course they are today. They're probably the prime symbol of erotic femininity. But when they came into Europe in the 17th century, they came in first as men's shoes, borrowed from Persian men's shoes. So it was as mounted warriors that it entered into Western fashion. And that, I think, was an important discovery on the part of shoe historians. That was
Elizabeth
Semmelhack. She did the research because previous researchers had indicated that they thought high heels came from chopines, from these very high platforms. And Elizabeth Semmelhack pointed out that no, on the contrary, it came from these men's Persian shoes, and it was an elite symbol that men latched onto, because who wouldn't want to look like a fabulous, exotic, mounted warrior? And then women followed suit, and it started with status, and then it moved into gender and erotic femininity. But now it's almost a universal sign of that. And so when we think of fetishism, I mean, there's the idea that they're phallic symbols, but I think there are very few women who want a closet full of phallic symbols. In fact, it's much more complicated, and it has much more to do with this symbolism, I think, of femininity.
Absolutely. And interestingly, the oldest pair of shoes in our collection and in the exhibition is from the 17th century, and very likely men's.
It's certainly a fact that people often do tend to keep and even bronze the first pair of baby shoes. And although I didn't notice this with my own son, now that my grandson is learning to walk, I see what a profound moment it is of sort of independence and grown-upness. And in fact, he's not walking yet, but he's starting to. And they told us that if he wanted to come in the toddler class in daycare, he'd have to wear shoes. And his mother was saying, in fact, it's probably healthier for children and easier to learn to walk in bare feet, where you can grip the ground. But we have such a strongly inculcated idea that shoes will protect your feet, and that's sort of the core reason for clothing at all, is to protect you, that I think that shoes have so much symbolism for us in terms of being an independent, ambulatory person, also the idea of them protecting the body, and just the symbolism of being a little person, and then you see the bronzed shoes, and they have outgrown them, and they've grown up, and that's just a kind of little, almost relic memento of when they were still a baby.
Exactly. And this reminds me that years ago, when a close friend had a very tiny baby, he was absolutely appalled that he had forgotten to put shoes on his baby at a restaurant. And he went on and on about, oh, that was so gross. And I said, he doesn't even walk. His feet are pristine and perfect. No one cares. But there was still this idea that to be acceptable in society, his baby should be wearing shoes.
Sure, absolutely. That's one of the earliest metaphors, keep them barefoot and pregnant. That somehow barefoot is seen as being primitive and not civilized, and shoes, in fact, were probably one of the first pieces of attire invented, because they do have certain practical purposes, and in terms of keeping your feet warm and sometimes giving you better traction on, for example, rough and rocky ground. But that Iceman who was discovered on the Swiss border, he was wearing shoes.
Of course, how could you not?
It was super exciting when Taschen asked if we wanted to do another book with them, because after we did Fashion Designers A to Z, which included some shoe designers like Manola Blahnik and Christian Louboutin, they asked if they could do one on our shoe collection. So naturally we said yes. And I guess there are about 400 different pairs of shoes in the book.
Yes.
Fewer in the show. That's what, 327 or something?
Exactly. No one's counting.
No one's counting, of course. But we do have such an amazing shoe collection. And it seems worthy of having a big deluxe Taschen book. I guess they're working on first an ultra luxurious version and then just a regular luxury version. And then they'll work their way down to sort of an everyday student can buy this version.
Exactly. And the book is formatted quite differently than the exhibition. We ended up doing a number of designers, I think just over 50 designers, organizing that in A to Z. And then at the end, there is a short chronology. It's a history of shoes in 100 styles, essentially. And it was a really fun project. It really set the exhibition in motion in many ways, because we ended up going through the 5,000 shoes in the database, selecting maybe 2,000 of those that looked like they'd be the greatest examples, and then literally looking at every single one of those to get to our final 400 selections.
It's kind of amazing, and we didn't want to do the show that would be chronology, and we didn't want to do a show that would just be designers, although we incorporated some chronology and some designers. But in a way, the exhibition takes off from my introductory essay, which is sort of, why shoes are significant to us. And we've finally identified these ideas of they're important to us in terms of our anatomy and physiognomy, how we can move and stand. And in terms of our identity, we've seen how women's shoes and men's shoes are almost always distinct. And then also in terms of this sort of quality of magic. You talked about Cinderella, but also red shoes being very symbolic of sexuality and passion and danger and status. And then I loved the flying sandals of Mercury, which then are picked up with the idea of sneakers being something which you could take off and you could leap and run and do everything so much better if you were wearing the right pair of sneakers.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a very fun project because I think it did help us to identify what we were missing. We don't have any wing sandals. Clearly we need those, but also really showed our strengths as well.
We couldn't really have done a chronology show or a worldwide shoe show with our collection. And although we certainly have just about every great designer shoe available, I think it was important putting that in identity, because shoes have a kind of brand identity. We think, are you a Blahnik person, kind of quirky, pretty? Are you a Louboutin person who's like super sexual? Where are you in the sort of shoe are you?
Right.
That really became important for us.
Yes. And one of the things I loved about the exhibition is that although we certainly have explanatory text for each of the sections, we don't have a lot of separate label copy, which meant we really wanted people to go through and interpret things themselves and really think about wearing these things, how they identify with particular kinds of shoes. And I hope that that makes it informative, but also quite fun.
Sneakers are not only the newest form of footwear compared to sandals and boots and other things, but also one of probably the most important and ubiquitous form of contemporary footwear.
Absolutely. And we identified quite early on that although we do have some really great early or rare styles of sneakers, what we really collect is fashion sneakers.
We're a fashion museum. So that was something we were glad we did have Air Jordans and Adidas and things, because our tendency as a collecting institution would be, let's get the high-heeled Norma Kamali sneakers. Let's get those really cool Balenciaga sneakers.
Exactly. And all of that is fun to see, but it is a nice mix within the exhibition. And I think it also gives a sense of why sneakers have become so important. Because, of course, something like an Air Jordan has almost always been a status symbol. But then you also have Balenciaga and Chloe and Louis Vuitton, all of these brands that are co-opting that idea of luxury sneakers, and it makes them more acceptable overall.
Well, and the old idea that women would collect shoes, that I remember there was a credit card ad once that showed a closet full of red high heel shoes, and the question mark was, is it a fetish? But now there are all of these sneakerheads who are almost all guys who collect sneakers fanatically, pay huge amounts of money for them, deal sneakers, like selling them. And their collecting is different. It's not so much to wear. Very often they don't take them out of the box. So it's a kind of investment-oriented collecting. But then there are all of the other guys who just wear sneakers because that's cool and it's casual and it's sporty. So that if you are on the subway and you look around, probably 90% of people and 99% of men are going to be wearing sneakers.
Absolutely. I'm always a bit jealous of those people. But like I said, sneakers don't work for me.
There are actually not that many shoes that are unwearable in the exhibition. There are a lot that look unwearable, but probably there are only 2 pairs that are completely unwearable, which is the Noritaka Tatehana ballet shoes, which Lady Gaga did wear, but they're 19 inches?
16,
16
I think.
inches. And then, of course, the Christian Louboutin ballet shoes, which you could just barely stand in holding on to something, but you certainly couldn't walk in. Taking off on that idea, interestingly, both of them taking off on the ballet idea, where standing on point and dancing on point is about as close as human beings can come to actually lifting off from the ground and no longer touching the ground. And from the beginning, that was seen as being like flying and being lifted up. So I think it's not surprising this idea of shoes lifting you off the ground and lifting you away from sort of material, mundane reality to some kind of more idealized realm, whether a realm of beauty, away from the sort of sheer meatiness of a naked foot, to something that was higher and more spiritualized, if you will.
And I know you had an experience wearing some of Noritaka Tatehana's shoes. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, Nori made me a pair of shoes when we opened Shoe Obsession. And although they were not as high, they were still about 7 inches high. And I had watched Daphne Guinness, and I knew she could walk in hers, and I did try and practice, and I did exercises to strengthen my ankles and calf muscles. My poor trainer, it was insane. And we were having the high heel exercises. I was able to wear them for 25 minutes while Bill Cunningham took pictures of them. After that, my ankles, calves, everything hurt. And I took them off and put on a pair of 5-inch Nicholas Kirkwood high heels. And it felt like putting on flip-flops.
And I loved when we worked on our 2013 exhibition, Shoe Obsession, together, because the premise of that show in part was that shoes had gotten very high.
Yes.
Heels and platforms had gotten very high. And I recall having purchased a new pair of boots during that time, and I thought to myself, oh, these are so wearable. The heel is quite low. And then I measured them one day, and they were 4.5 inches. And I was like, oh, my mind is warped from this exhibition.
Yes, because back in 2013, it was the absolute height for shoes, or at least for that period. Mm-hmm. And then shortly thereafter, they went down a bit, but that's always the case. They go down, they go up. A lot of reporters have been saying, oh, now after the pandemic, everybody's going to be wearing flats and sneakers. No way. I mean, it goes down and it comes right back up again. They said the same thing after 9/11. People will go in for more practical shoes, but then they almost always, many women will go back to high heels, at least for special occasions.
Absolutely. And another thing I noticed from that time period in 2013 is that all of the shoes I bought then are still completely wearable today. And I think that might be part of the appeal of contemporary shoes. They don't tend to go in and out of style as quickly, so you can hold on to them. They really are kind of an investment.
Well, and the fact that fashion in general doesn't go in and out. You have multiple styles. So even if it was out for a couple of years, it would be bound to come back in again.
Exactly.
And people might say, oh my God, you bought those Pradas. You were so brilliant. Even if they recognized that it was an old pair of shoes, you would just be so brilliant for having gotten something so memorable.
Right, it becomes cool again a few years later, yeah.
It's interesting that people think that certain styles are timeless, because timeless doesn't really apply to fashion. Things come in and out of fashion and often come back frequently, so they become part of the vocabulary of fashion. But we certainly noticed early on that shoe designers will look for historical references. Like in the 70s, they look back at the 30s, and then in the 90s, they look back at the 70s. Whenever certain aspects of fashion move in a certain direction, whether because of a movie or because of a style of music or something will be moving, and you can pick up on an element of style, not from nostalgia, because most people aren't really aware of when it came from, but I think because of familiarity and because it looks right at that moment.
Exactly, yeah, and I think that was one of the most fun parts to put together in the exhibition, was making comparisons between historical and then whatever the more contemporary version of that was, and that layering of history, as you mentioned, this 40s, 70s, 90s, 2010s, all of these layered references, and every time there's an update, you can always tell the difference if you're familiar enough with shoes.
Yes, it's not going to be the same, but it's the same with fashion. I mean, we have 50s revival dresses, the 80s look revived, the 50s again, then later on that came back, but each iteration is like a palimpsest. There are layers and layers of meaning and different aspects of it you could pick up on.
Absolutely. My favorite shoes are by the brand Pelican, and it's partly because I'm obsessed with this glam rock early to mid 70s era, but also because they're really rare. Pelican was based on the Bowery. It was run by a husband and wife team, and they made shoes for all kinds of cool people, including David Bowie, and they just had a really incredible style. Usually everything's handmade, hand-painted, and they're made from polyurethane, so it's actually really rare that they exist. They were in small numbers to begin with, but as I was researching for the book and the exhibition, one of the favorite things I learned about this brand in particular was that they did 3 sizes only. They basically traced their friends' feet and came up with these sort of average sizes, 1, 2, 3, and we have examples of each in the exhibition. And apparently that worked for everybody. So I just thought that was a really interesting kind of DIY approach to shoemaking.
That's a very interesting approach. Was it a couple?
Yes.
That's interesting.
A husband and wife team, yes.
The idea of shoe designers in and of itself is kind of interesting, because you had shoemakers for years and they were anonymous, and then people came up and put their name on the shoe. Some of those early, the Pinets and the Premiers and some of the early Ferragamos are just so beautiful because you can see that they had all of the skill of craftsmanship, but then they also had a different attitude. It was more like an artistic production. They were thinking of the shoe differently.
And I think we see some of their work in different ways echoed in contemporary shoes that look unwearable, but in fact have that sculptural quality to them, and so we kind of view them as wearable art, or art that you wear on your feet.
I think that's one of the special things about shoes, because clothes, if you take off clothes, it's like a snake shedding its skin. It's just this little puddle of nothing on the floor. But shoes are little sculptures. And people told me, they said, well, if the shoe's uncomfortable, I'll just put them on my desk and admire them, which is more or less what I do with my Noritakas.
I do that with a pair of Louboutins.
The old slogans about, you have to suffer to be beautiful, don't apply in general, I think, to contemporary women. And certainly it's not masochism that makes women often wear uncomfortable shoes. But I think that there is a kind of trade-off that you see where if it's an occasion when you really want to look glamorous and successful or powerful, then people are willing to put up with a degree of discomfort. I remember when I did my corset show, And I had a replica 1880s corset made, and people said, wow, is that not horribly uncomfortable? And I said, no, the corset's fine, but my feet are killing me. Wearing, high-heeled shoes on a cement floor for 2.5 hours with the reception was just excruciating. But I wanted to look good at the opening. I would never have worn that, to walk out to the grocery store on an ordinary day.
Right, and I think personally, that's my attraction to things like high heels, even if they're not as comfortable. It's about completing the look. And I think many of us have a certain silhouette or idea in mind. So for example, if I'm ever wearing a skirt that's below the knee, it always has to go with a heel. I just need that bit of length. And I think that helps to perpetuate uncomfortable shoes as well.
Sure, because a midi skirt looks so frumpy with flats.
Exactly.
Unless you go all the way down to your ankles, and then I think you can kind of get away with a flat or a medium heel.
And can you tell us your story about the Birkenstock shoes from your exhibition in 1999?
Oh, God, I love that. I had put up a pair of Birkenstocks in the unisex section of my first shoe exhibition. And we had a Brazilian journalist who came in, followed by her TV crew. And she made a beeline straight for the Birkenstock, screaming, no Latin woman would wear a shoe like this.
I
And
love
of course,
that.
it's a German shoe. It had completely different ideas about the importance of comfort versus glamour and sexiness.
Right, and that was before all the designer collaborations
Yes.
and the things that have given Birkenstocks a bit more sex appeal in recent years.
Birkenstocks are one of many kinds of ugly shoes which are now considered sort of sexy in a fashionable way. Not sexy in that traditional man-pleasing way, but in a way that if you want to be trendy, it's like, these Birkenstocks are, by Rick Owens. These are by so-and-so. One of the shoes that I donated to the museum was the lotus shoe, the shoe worn by a Chinese woman who'd had bound feet. And of course, a foot binding lasted for about 1,000 years in China and is usually perceived as one of the most grotesque examples of female oppression. But as my friend Dorothy Coe explained, after having researched it for years, it's a much more complicated subject than that. Women, mothers, and grandmothers were deeply involved in foot binding. Foot binding was not only a way of emphasizing status and femininity, but also a way of emphasizing that you were an ethnic Chinese person, a Han person. Because, for example, Manchu women did not have bound feet. They wore completely different shoes. And there were degrees and kinds of foot binding over the years. Although lots of Westerners had tried to get Chinese to give it up. And then modernist Chinese leftists wanted women to give up foot binding and step into a modern world. And that partly led to the development of new styles of dress for urban Chinese women. And that in turn led to the adoption of Western shoes, which then replaced bound foot shoes, and particularly high-heeled shoes in the 1920s, which have a sort of visual, making your foot look smaller because it's tilted, which had a similar effect with bound foot shoes, which also had the pointed toe and that tilted thing. But foot binding, that was not a particularly small bound foot shoe. They went smaller than that. But it was definitely a form of physical transformation. I mean, the foot at its most extreme was broken and then bound to keep it from growing further.
Right, and we included that shoe in our section on glass slippers for a couple of reasons. One being that the earliest recorded tale of Cinderella comes from China, from the 9th century. And of course, it's centered on the idea of the small foot, which is part of the Cinderella story, and also a bit of the mutilation, to be honest, when the stepsister actually hacks at her own feet to try to fit into Cinderella's slipper. So there's that kind of association there that we wanted to include the lotus shoe.
You see that in many cultures, the idea that because of sexual dimorphism, different body types for men and women, the fact that women tend to have smaller feet, often you have the sexually dimorphic features become sort of quasi-fetishized. And people think, oh, well, a woman should have little feet. That's sort of a desirable attribute. And then there was the William Klein movie, Qui êtes-vous, Polly Magoo, where there's a very pompous French professor who's pontificating about the real meaning of the Cinderella story. And he says, fetishism, mutilation, pain, fashion in a nutshell, which kind of sums up the Cinderella story in an ironic way, but has some reality for fashion, in as much as fashion is always about transforming and fashioning the body, sometimes in ways which are physically uncomfortable, like corsetry or foot binding or high heels.
Mm-hmm. Fairy tales are very interesting when it comes to fashion because there often aren't specific references to things. They tend to be quite vague. And that was part of the reason that I was so fascinated by references to dress. And it kind of depends on the tale as to why shoes become such a part of it. We spoke already a bit about Cinderella and how she was meant to be physically perfect, essentially. So her small foot, the smallest foot in the kingdom, essentially. No one else could wear her glass slipper. That was really important to the tale. When it comes to the red shoes, the Hans Christian Andersen tale, that was really about wanting something that was beyond your means. And within that tale, the young orphan woman is taken in by an older woman who also happens to be blind, and this young girl becomes obsessed with red shoes, and those are not meant to be anything she's allowed to wear, essentially. She sees them on a little princess. So they become real objects of status. The idea of red was something that was very hard to achieve during that time.
Very expensive.
Very expensive. So again, it kind of depends on the tale, but I think that shoes are a really easy visual clue. They're something that everyone understood. And of course, a lot of these fairy tales are things that were passed down through generations. So the idea of the small foot coming from 9th century China is something that's easily translated into 17th century Europe and is completely understandable.
And boots, of course, which play a role, like in the 7 League Boots and Puss in Boots. I mean, boots have been a symbol of masculinity and power since ancient Greece and Rome. I mean, the Roman legions marched in boots, and then you have, 19th and 20th century generals talking about, the sound of marching boots. Boots allow you to cover territory rapidly, rough territory, and they're fierce as well as protective. They're not just protecting your feet, you can kick people with boots. And so they become almost a kind of weapon. And these stories that you can travel fast, but it's not just flying slippers, not just winged slippers, you can also kind of stride over the world like a victorious army.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that military connotation I think is very interesting.
And when men stopped wearing high heels in the mid-18th century, and then women stopped wearing high heels about 50 years later in the late 18th century, women switched to little ballet-like flats that made their feet look small and delicate, and men switched to boots, which made them look big and ferocious.
Right.
So, yes, you have, I think in Brazil, the slang words for a femme lesbian and a butch lesbian are respectively ballet slipper and army boot.
Fascinating.
I think the key is that many people believe that they can read someone by their shoes. They can tell their age, gender, personality, tastes, socioeconomic status. It's not necessarily true, but people believe this. And so I think people also make a point of wearing shoes that will give some aspect of their personality. Now, if you have at home 100 pairs of shoes, that doesn't mean you've got multiple personality disorder. It just means they're different facets to your personality. But I was inspired by this little book, Shoe Are You, which talked about common beliefs and stereotypes that, if you're a ballerina person, you're like this, and if you wear loafers, you're like that. And I thought it would be nice to try and get people to look at the shoes and start thinking, am I a Gucci loafer person? Or am I, a Belgian loafer person? Do I like this kind of Adidas sneaker, or do I like that kind of expensive designer sneaker? Because I think there are many aspects of our identity that can play out with shoes.
Absolutely. And that for me was one of the best parts of putting together this exhibition. You and I working on our cork board, figuring out what these pairings could be, because oftentimes we were able to kind of swap things out in really interesting ways. It was really fun to play with the idea of identity and read all these articles. I think my favorite was a actual psychological study where people were interviewed about what dirty and worn versus clean and pristine shoes meant. And dirty and worn apparently meant that you were laid back, and clean and pristine meant that you were very uptight. So I
That
thought
must be
that
a
was
very
funny.
young set of people.
I know.
Older people definitely feel like, down at the heel means, oh, you can't expect him to take you out for dinner.
Exactly. Yeah, it was a really interesting thing, but that it's also worked its way into psychology,
Yes.
which fashion often does.
Often does, and shoes in particular. Well, I love the pairing too, because when we were trying to decide not to have labels with everything, it became really important to have two different shoes side by side so that people would look at them and compare them. Because that's one way you can always get museum visitors to think for themselves, is by putting things together that seem to talk to each other. And so they go, why are they together? They're so different, and what that difference is about.
Yes, and even our own differences in opinion and thought about things, I think, really helped us to co-curate in a really cohesive way. It was actually really fun to work with someone else so that it's not all about, oh, I think this about this shoe. You might have had a completely different opinion. It was fascinating.
Of course, and that's one of the big issues with clothes, because you can't dictate to people how they're going to read your clothes. You may think you can, but you really can't. They may read it in an entirely different way.
Exactly, and here they're encouraged to.
Yes. When we started working on anatomy, in addition to how shoes made you stand or move, I was very interested in the attention that shoes called to particular parts of your body. I remembered working on sort of sexual aspects of shoes and people being horrified by toe cleavage, and how funny it was to think of the little cracks between your toes being compared to the crack between your breasts, and the fact that people seem to really see the foot as being like a sort of miniature version of the body, so that toe cleavage are assimilated to the breast, the back of the heel is assimilated to the derriere, so that in slingback shoes it seems, as though you're showing your bottom to the world. And then, of course, with the boots, when we traced the height of the boot from ankle boots through knee-high boots to thigh-high boots, how it kept drawing your eye further and further up the leg. Just like the old blues song, don't put your hand on my thigh, because then you might try to put your hand even higher. So this idea that it could call attention to different parts of your body, and that the foot was also seen as a synecdoche for the body as a whole.
And that reminds me that one of my favorite examples in the exhibition is Beth Levine's topless shoe from the 1950s, which is literally a sole and a heel and nothing else.
That's right.
The ultimate naked shoe.
Exactly.
And that one's so fascinating because, of course, we don't wear the things that are in the museum collection ever, but those shoes were sold with their own bottle of adhesive, and that's how they were meant to stay on the foot. And I'm always fascinated by if and how that worked exactly.
Right. The bottles, of course, have long since disappeared or dried up. We can't test them out.
Exactly.
Years ago, the New York Times called me the high-heeled historian, and I used to wear high heels all the time. In recent years, much less so. I mean, I'm tending to wear flats or sneakers a lot of the time, which in a way horrifies me. I feel like I'm turning into my mother, like a little old sneaker-wearing lady. But of course, they're much cooler sneakers than she wore.
My favorite pair of shoes that I admittedly never really wear are Louboutins from maybe 2012. It was when we were working on Shoe Obsession, and I went to a sample sale. We got a couple of pairs for the museum, and then I bought a pair for myself, and it was by far the most expensive and luxurious shoe I'd ever bought at that time in my life. And I've worn them a few times, and they're lovely, but they're also white suede, so I wear them sparingly. But I still keep them as little sculptures and actually have them in my apartment as a moment in time when I was quite proud I could finally afford these lovely shoes.
Oh, yes. So It's interesting. Over the years, people have given me all kinds of little shoe tchotchkes, little miniature shoes, shoe pins, shoe magnets. There's something about shoes. They had a big show about shoes at the Philadelphia Museum of Art years ago, and they had a big museum store, and they had so many things that were shaped like shoes.
It's amazing. It really is a whole market unto itself, those little tchotchkes.
Maybe another show.
Yeah.